Good evening, all. And tonight we have a subject very dear to my heart for two reasons. What I will be saying I have first-hand experience of, and I have spent the last 30 years of my life dealing with ownership of land. Usually trying to get people to transfer ownership so I could make a buck. As a real estate broker here in California. Anyway, I was prompted actually to choose this subject for tonight by the very, very last pages of a wonderful little book that Margaret picked up on the eBay. And it has nothing to do with the ownership of land, really, except that the author, Darrell Figgis, dealt with a document written by the Earl of Tyrone, the great ONeill, in a last effort in 1599 to make peace with Elizabeth. And reading it, I was struck by how well it described the old system, the old social system, and how deeply the relationship between the social system and the ownership of land was. So I started to think how central the ownership of land is to Ireland's history, and how much of a chieftain and a great statesman ONeill was to zero in on that and recognize how central it was. And of course, for that very same reason, Elizabeth, on the other hand, rejected it out of hand, much like Maggie Thatcher with the out, out, out speech. She immediately recognized it, and so did her consigliere, Cecil, for example, Lord Burleigh. They recognized right away the depth of significance that it had. So that's why that's one of the reasons I chose it. But we've talked about the land many times before, but tonight we'll just talk about nothing else but it. And if you can't talk about land in ancient Ireland, and I'm going to try, if I can, and go all the way up to modern times and speak about the Land Commission and the Land League and all the various land acts and so on. So hopefully I'll be able to connect all the Irish history in terms of land ownership. So if I spend too much time on the ancient world, try and remind me of that so that I move forward. But you can't talk about about land ownership in the ancient Ireland without talking a little about the Brehon laws, because the Brehon laws were comprehensive, but of course a tremendous amount had to do with the ownership of land. So I'm going to, because I made some notes today, and I might get more meaning out of it if I just read it. And what I'll do is I'll claim the liberty to go off on my usual little tangents when I go through it. Margaret's throwing her eyes in the air, but I like to do that. The Irish land owning system was fundamental to Irish society. It survived the Norman invasion, but did not survive the Tudor conquest. It survived the Norman invasion, by the way. Well, I won't go into that for many reasons. One gained land by a delicate combination of inheritance and industry. Throughout all of Irish life, even a slave could actually raise himself above his station, thus moving up the social ladder. Ireland was divided into roughly 100 tuatha. Now, that 100 is probably very inaccurate, but just to give you an idea, it wasn't 1,000 and it was more than 100, that sort of thing. A tuatha was the equivalent of a modern country. Through its king, it gave each of its Tuhana or Orchach, which were citizens, lots of different names for people who lived there and their status within the, which represent their various status within the Tua, the protection of its laws. An outsider was known as a Dori and technically had no legal rights. Even to this day, they use, so you'll hear the word Dori used in country words, that he's a Dori. However, depending on one's rank or status elsewhere, certain rights were extended, but Dori, no matter how noble they were never quite trusted. And their oath, if you like, if they swore an oath against you, didn't have as much weight as if a person of rank in your own Tuatha did. Now, there was basically two kinds of people. Those who owned... Huh?
What century are we in?
Oh, what millennia we're in is probably more accurate. I'm everything before before the 11th century in Ireland, before the conquest in England, 1066. So, 1,000 years ago and before is probably a good place to all up to 1,000 years ago. So those who had some chance of becoming landowners and those who quite frankly didn't. But I'm not going to deal too much with I do have some interesting stuff here about the different status of society, so probably a good idea to at least touch on it. The ladies will find it interesting that the lowest status was a male slave, and the next one higher was a female slave. So a female slave actually had more value than a male slave, because I guess she could procreate herself and she had other skills and so on. And so anyway, she was called a cool, just like a C-O, like the kids say today, K-C-U-M, Shavia, A-L, a cool. By the way, male slave was called a mug or mug. So I guess that's where that expression comes from. So they could raise themselves up above their status, but it took work, and they had to have certainly some skills and some unusual attributes. Interestingly enough, again as an aside, the offspring of a slave woman held exactly the same status as the father, so that if she was impregnated by a nobleman, she had it made, which was extraordinary. Because they had no concept of legitimacy or the Christian marriage as we understand it. So that certainly was one way for a cool to raise herself up, was to bed herself down with a nobleman, or even anybody above a few steps above her status, and at least it was kind of like an illegal alien having a child in another country, and then sort of getting some of their status. But I don't want to go in too much into the different strata, but I want to go straight and start with, there was a number of other people, yeah. Together they were known as Fúdracha, and there's still shades of Fúdrachan and Fúdracha. We're sort of like the non-landed people, the people who didn't have land. And of course these were all non-noble. The nobility then was at a turbulence. So we're talking about all the people who lived below the nobility level. Now, I'll get back to my little thingy here. So when I talk now about the first rung on the land ownership ladder by birth rather than by merit was a boy known as the Midboss. And that was at puberty, say 14. If he was ready to go out and fight in an army, in the king's army, he was, and his father was on the rung to leather. He was an O'Cara, or his grandfather more likely would be a Boara. So I'm going to talk about those three divisions, starting with the Midboss. Now, in Irish, boch is like a hut. You'll often still hear the expression of bochán. You know, a little hut would be referred to as bochán, and so on. So the size of the house that you lived in reflected your status, and it was very carefully actually measured. And of course, we were talking about round roths, the little ring forts. And the ones that have survived, of course, are the large ones, but there would have been thousands, tens of thousands of them around. The ones that just survive, and we see the traces of them, would be local rees of tuas. They would have been Tishas of a tua. But they were regulated, and everything was done by diameter. So it was the diameter of so it tells you again that it was Amshir Nathuaha. It was the time when the ring forts. Yes. So these ring forts, little things, didn't suddenly spring out of nowhere. That was the way of life for millennia, for thousands of years, and it was very highly regulated how big of a ring fort you could have, depending on your status. Anyway, so you can see why they would use the word huts or boh to identify somebody. You might say, well, why would they? Because it describes where you're at. You're a person from this little hut. So then you were a midboss by virtue of the fact that your father was an O'Cara. Now, I suspect that and by the way, the word Ara appears all the time. And even today, a minister in the Irish government is called an Ara. It's a guard. It's somebody. It's a responsible person. It has a whole wide meaning, so that you'll see it used a lot. But it denotes somebody that is has responsibility for other things. You know, it means care. So you're in the care. You're a caretaker. You have care of something, whether it's physical or other people, and it has, of course, privileges and some obligations. So the word Ara, A-I-R-E, yes, A-I-R-E, is a very common. It's a word that's used a great deal in Irish sociology, social structure. So the word O'Cara and Boara, and then as you go on up the line, there's lots of other kinds of aras as well. But we'll start with there's probably going to be 3 generations involved in this progression from Midboss to an O'Cara to a Boara, which corresponds exactly with the Gavelkind, the kind of the larger family. And then there's a slightly larger one than that called a Derfina, which is Derv actually meaning truth, believe it or not. It's like the true Finny. Finny is kind of a clan. It's the nearest thing that the Irish have to a clan, but their clan concept is quite different to the Scottish and the European, because it's not quite so tied to a single ancestor. They can take people in and do all kinds of things with them. It actually has more to do with the land than the bloodline or the DNA. So, which again emphasizes how important and how totally identified the whole structure was with the land. Anyway, well, I'll read it to you. A young man of, say, 14 was known as the Midboss, a status he would share with his brothers and sisters. By the way, it was not just matrilinear, and it certainly was not primogeniture or any of that stuff. In other words, males and females were, by and large, equal. Now, there were certain things that males dominated, of course, than females, but nevertheless, rights were pretty well universal. And sisters of all his first cousins until he moved up the ladder. So that a young Midboss would find himself with a clatter of siblings, and if his father had 4 or 5 brothers or sisters and all that crowd, so he could have quite a hunk of compete or fellow Midboss.
So what's the spelling of that word?
Midboh.
Midboss.
Well, it would be th, boh. It would be th. But you see, we don't have bot. We don't have an h in the yeah. So it's difficult when you translate it. You have to do the best you can into English. But mid is still mid, like in midboh. But the boh is a house. It's a boh. So that's so that it's identified with his status in that he actually could have a house. Yeah, well, it's the smallest. It's kind of the smallest, next above a doghouse kind of thing. But he actually gets to have a house if he can have one, or a hut of his own. So he's dependent upon his parents and his elder siblings, but he theoretically could have a bohon of his own. It seems to be what the idea was. But just so you understand this bunch of people. Now remember, this is within a Gavelkind, it's within 3 generations. It's not means this is not a status that's it's repeated, of course, all around the Thua, the parish, the little kingdom, whatever. But we're talking about within your own clan. So there could be quite a few of them. Now, I'm telling you about the highest rank among the non-noble classes was the Boara. So he's at the top, and I'll explain to him in a minute who he was. Before the Midboss, in line for that status, would be his father and mother, his uncles and his aunts, who would still be known as Okara. Now, it's usually written down as O-C-A-I-R-A. I actually take that to mean Og. Ogar, in other words, like a young Ara. It's one who is not the Bo-Ara. There usually is only one Bo-Ara, the guy at the top, who was usually the grandfather. So now if you take the next layer up, the Okara, that would be, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the 14-year-old kid, it would be his father and all that generation, all his uncles and aunts, all that crowd. Now they all stand between him and the top guy, who would be the Bo-Ara. So you can see that the Bo-Ara is quite an important person. He's somebody who undoubtedly is the elder, one of the elders of the clan, by necessity, because you don't get there just by being, tough or getting elected or anything. It's a progressive thing. So then, what would happen after that is how do I say? In life, the stars and would be still known as his grandfather, his grandmother or grandfather would be the current Bo-Ara. The path to upward mobility lay in land ownership, but the early acquisition of a share in a plough team, a lime kiln, a millstone, or a barn helped, because a Bo-Ara was expected to eventually own all of these things. So, even though you still had pretty strong impediments between you and the Bo-Ara, you could still do a lot of things. By various ways, you could start owning maybe a small share in a plough team. So you can see there was great value put on the implements of food production. Now, if you survived your Midboss years, the reason I say that is because it's from those ranks that the Ree of the Tua drew his fighting men. So you can see there was a natural tendency for those numbers to get weeded out a little bit. And women died in childbirth, and there was all kinds of things that happened. So natural selection kind of was involved. So there was that, and the number of people that was in your group, so to speak. And that, the extent to which you moved up depended upon how popular your father or grandmother had been with the ladies. Just a little tongue-in-cheek there. So that, obviously, if you were lucky enough to have a father that nobody really liked very much, chances are you didn't have a lot of siblings, but if he was a very popular chieftain or whatever, and man, he just got around, then you probably weren't going to do too good. Now, that's the individuals, the people. Now, land. How was land measured? Well, it's very simple, actually, because land in ancient Ireland was measured not by a unit of area, such as a modern acre, but by the grass of 3 cows. And you still hear that expression, the grass of a cow, or the grass, and when you think about it, it's very clever, because, see, different land was more valuable than other land. A land that was very rocky and stony, and it might take quite a bit of it to feed a cow. So and I could stay, you could tell that would, so that the amount of land to feed 3 cows was known as, you'd never guess it, by the ancient equivalent for a cool. Yes. Now this doesn't mean now that there was slavery right down until this time, but a slave woman in ancient times was considered the equivalent in value of 3 cows.
So they called it land.
They called the land, which was equivalent, an amount of land which was the grass of 3 cows, a cool. So that's very interesting. But as I said, don't think that meant that slavery, that they were interchangeable. The word cool originally meant a female slave. In the days of slavery, a female slave was worth roughly 3 cows. The terminology continued long after slavery was extinct. I'll talk about slavery just for a second here. Slavery was a just in case you think that it was like a very important part, which in older times it was more important. But slavery was self-restraining in ancient Ireland. Not so much because of St. Patrick, but despite him. Patrick and the Christians, give themselves a lot of credit for. They give him credit for everything. They give themselves credit as wiping out slavery, and certainly he raved tremendously against slavery, mainly because he was a little sore spot. He had been a slave himself. But the Irish never accepted St. Patrick's Christian concept of marriage and legitimacy, not even right down into Elizabethan times. As a result, the son or daughter of a slave by a boara, or even a nobleman, had the same standing as his quote-unquote legitimate children. Thus its growth was internally restricted. So I've often maintained that while it was there, it wasn't something that was going to explode. But there's no doubt it was there. And incidentally, or interestingly enough, again as an aside, the main source of slaves in Ireland was Britain. And the Irish purchased them from the British. And the British were known for selling their children into slavery. And the port that was prime in conducting that trade was Bristol. So Bristol was a slave port from England to Ireland long before slavery, long before it carried on its ancient trade. I just thought I'd throw that in there for a moment. And of course, as we know, Patrick was brought back as a slave. But I suspect that was as a result of raiding rather than as a result of trade, although who knows. Now I want to talk about the Tua. We've talked about the various stratas of society, and now we're only talking now about those who are on the ladder, on the rung to land ownership. There's a whole lot of other people who are not going to get there, who are basically farm labourers and other professions. The Tua was both a political and an economic unit. Very important to understand. It had a complete internal economy based on the communal ownership of the area of land defined by its recognized boundaries. Now I say all of those words very carefully because recognized boundaries. In fact, most of the neighboring Tuaks had, what would you call it, treaties. They had understanding, pardon? Agreements. I was looking for another word. Anyway, but all that they're fine with each other. So, pardon? No, more than alliance. I will come back to it in a moment. But the treaties is probably as good a word as any. That they recognized each other's borders. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't border battles all the time, unfortunately. But in theory, or in principle at least, the borders were recognized. Now, the fact that it was internally self-sufficient is incredibly important, because in many ways, that is why it was a Tua. And if you look at them and if you see, roughly, if you're studying Irish and you look at them, they roughly are equivalent to the modern baronies. If you look at the baronies, they're very, if you look at the barony, I think you'll agree with that, Robert, that baronies, if you look at the various baronies, which are a very old measure in Ireland, and I suspect, and I think a lot of other people have said so, that they tend to be the ancient Tuaks.
Could you spell that word again?
Baronies?
No.
Well, Tua. Well, it's, I mean, in Ireland it's T,
yeah.
big Th, Tua. There's no short T in Irish. It's all Th, or else H. The T is either T or it's aspirated to H. So Tua has two T's. One, the first one not aspirated, T, and the second one aspirated, H. Tua. So it's T-U-A, T,
That's a
Shavia, dot.
measurement of land.
Well, no, it's an economic and political unit,
Oh, okay.
which corresponds on the map of Ireland today
To a
into
barony,
baronies,
yeah.
baronies, yes, which came in, which were used by the English in their administration. In other words, anglicised versions. They were used to the idea of baronies over there, and then shires later on, which became counties, and counties superimposed on baronies. But all of those more recent subdivisions are post-Norman or Tudor conquest. There's two great conquests in Ireland, the Norman conquest and the Tudor conquest, in case you hadn't kind of figured that out from my talking earlier. Now, the Tua, I want to talk now about the Tua. So it's important that you first of all understand T-U-A-T. Only the second T is aspirated, and it's yes. And nowadays we call it, it would be written T-U-A-T-H. So we put a little H after the T to show that it's aspirated. And it looks horrible. It really is. So thank goodness we're going back to a font which is true to the old script. So a Tua was both a political and an economic unit. And as I said, it was an economic unit first and a political unit second. And it had a complete internal economy based on communal ownership, or at least a concept of ownership, of the area of the land defined by its recognized borders. So the Muncher na Tuatha, the people of the Tua, all the various names that they were called, I mentioned them earlier, Tuhana, which, the people of Anach, the people Tua, Anach, the people of the Tua. Ácha is people from around the place. Ácha is a place. Ácha, from this place. Those are all names that you'll find. There's lots of others, but that are common and understood in the Irish language. The Irish language is rich with those kind of words. But as I said earlier, the Tua was the equivalent to a modern country. It was a nation. And it was interesting in ONeill's letter to Queen Elizabeth, and because he was writing essentially to the court, and he was writing in English, and of course he'd been educated in English, although he spoke English. He actually he called them the nations. So it's sort of like the Indians here, where we talk about the nations. So it's very similar to that. They had autonomy. They had sovereign, and they owned their lands. Very, very similar, actually, and probably was fairly typical all around the world. That a people came into ownership of a peninsula, a valley, an island, something which was an economic unit. You could see that they had everything they needed for self-sustaining. We're using the great word now, sustainability. That's the big buzzword in today's world. Well, they understood sustainability long before we did, in a real sense. Now, each Tua had a Tisha, elected from a royal household, and an elected Taoiseach, or Taoiseach, ready to succeed him. Now, I use the word Tisha very carefully because there's lots of words, rees, all kinds of things. I prefer the word Tisha, and so did the young Irish state when it became independent. It used the words Ara for ministers and Tisha for the prime minister, and the word Taoiseach or Taoiseach for the vice president, not vice president, but the vice prime minister, so to speak. I like them for that reason, and they were good choices. They did choose very well, and in an effort to hark back. Now, I mentioned the word royal. Again, the word royal is maybe a little misleading because it tends to be European and British, but nevertheless, we did use the word re, and most European languages do use something like re. Pardon? Rex, re, yeah, so many different variations, but there's some certain words, so we certainly use that as well. But essentially noble. And if I may digress just for a second on how you became noble. It's very interesting how you became noble. And it's fascinating because you can see that the way they bred cattle, and they almost bred people, in the sense that they understood nature very well. And you did not become noble overnight, or you did not become noble in one generation. It took 4 generations to become noble. Did you know that, Robert? You did.
Heard something about it.
Yeah. Well, he's like a real expert. But the 4 generations. Now think about this. That means that if a young man was extraordinarily gifted, like Michael, what's his name, the swimmer? Forgotten already. The swimmer, Michael.
Phelps.
Michael Phelps. Now if after 4 generations that his son and his son just, cranked up, well, there was something in those genes. There was something about those people, Otherwise, the next generation could be a complete washout. Whereas in the English system, they totally bastardized that whole thing. They really, by just a rise or night, just because you was master of the garter or something like that, or you were played around with whatever, there was, so you could become ennobled, and you may be a stuttering idiot. But whereas under the Irish system, and many of them were, by the way, anyway, Well, they were, because of inbreeding. It was the complete antithesis. Seriously, that was one of the problems with royalty, as hereditary royalty, as practiced in a lot of European houses, because it didn't allow for the fact that, well, what if this guy is a deadbeat? Well, you didn't go on in the thing. It was each generation was separate. Anyway, the Tua elected a Tisha from a royal household, from a noble household. In other words, a household that was generally recognized to be particularly talented. So you can see the concept of nobility is important here. It wasn't a privilege, it was something that was earned over many generations. And by the way, it was a lot easier to lose than to gain. And many, many lost it very quickly because of misslips. Okay, now the Tisha held an area of what's known as mensal land, the income from which he spent to maintain a slew of Brehons, poets, historians, and musicians. So, again, the honour also brought a lot of obligations with him. Now, mensal land is something that goes with the office. I don't know where it comes from. I suspect that it's a Roman word meaning table. Something, where it was mensa. We all know, if ever learned that in Sam, it was a table. Or mesa in Spanish, but it's something that was given in some way, and it was not again hereditary. It was only there. It was only his, like a bishop, when he retires or he doesn't give his palace to his children, legitimate or otherwise. So the concept was the same in the established church in England. Anyway, out of that land, he had to maintain a fairly large menagerie of historians and learned people and so on. And that was very, very clever, really, because they were not then a burden. You didn't have this later concept of coin and livery, as it was known as, which was a dreadful imposition on the people, where they weren't taxing them. So the land pretty well took care of itself. Yes, there was things that you had to do and responsibilities that you had depending on what you owned, but it wasn't like the old feudal system. Okay, the land of Ireland was thus held. I've just described it. That whole system was known to the English as the Gaelic state, and that's how ONeill thought of it, and that's how modern historians think of it. So in other words, roughly say 100 Tua, all organised very similar. People say Ireland was not a united country. It's extraordinarily united in the sense that certainly there was variations in Brehon laws and so on from Tua to Tua, because of local conditions and whatever. But nevertheless, the structure was very uniform throughout all of Ireland. So Ireland was extraordinarily coherent in its culture and social structure, and the whole thing could be thought of as the Gaelic state. Now, there were larger units like the 4 or 5 provinces, and yes, there were titles and kings of higher, that of Moon, Ola, Connachtha, and ONeill and Lion. Those were before the Normans added the word stir at the end of them, and Lion became Leinster, Ola became Ulster. Stir is the Norman word for a place. So, with Connachtha, ONeill kind of disappeared, so there was only 4. But there were certain recognitions like Meath and Louth that had great resonance with the ancient Irish, and they deferred to them in many ways, and they recognized, they were very conscious of talent and privilege. Well, maybe not privilege, but location. I mean, Lu, which I always have to believe had something to do with the sun god, because in that area there was quite a lot of ancient, probably sun worshipping, or certainly you know, you could say that Newgrange is evidence of sun worship in a sense, but there was certainly a deference to them, and the various other places like Anwaka and Brehon and Donegal and various places like that, that they sort of did recognize as being certain overlords of those areas. And then again, without any great, it was more for formality, that they actually recognized to a greater or lesser extent throughout many millennia the supremacy of Tara as being the seat of, if there was a high king, certainly the top equal among equals sort of thing. But there was not an administration, if you like, a top-down administration. It was very much a tuath. So therefore I say that the Gaelic state really, if you understand the concept of the tuath and how it was, you understand enough. You don't really need to go into all the big kings, because there weren't any. They were just things that were recognized between the various collections, if you like, of tuath. Now, the most important part of the whole thing, as far as the English were concerned, was the Irish concept of land ownership and the fact that it was bottom up rather than top down, and that it was vested in the people. So the land of Ireland was thus held, now I'm going to jump into history a little bit and how it started to come here, was thus held until the defeat of ONeill at Kinsale. And I say the defeat of ONeill because essentially it was ONeill that was defeated at Kinsale. I know it was ONeill and O'Donnell and it was all this, but it was essentially ONeill. Now, despite all the Tudor despoliations, the English plantations had completely failed up until then. So it's actually wrong to say that Ireland had been conquered up until then. It had been tremendously destroyed by the Tudor wars and their attempts to rule and to plant Ireland, but they had largely failed. The early ones of the southeast had totally failed, and all of those colonists had hightailed it back to England with Edmund Spencer and various people like that, and Sir Walter Raleigh and whatever. They certainly did not exist. And of course, Ulster was entirely Gaelic and was totally untouched by any plantations or despoilations, if you like. And Connacht was largely destroyed by what later became the Earl of Lucan, or the Lord Lucan's family, the Binghams. And even the most, how would I say, determined effort that had been made by the Tudors in Leeks and Offaly, which was at once called King's County and Queen's County, had reverted back to the O'Moores and the various families there. They didn't exist, except for some houses where some of the old planter people still lived in great defended houses. So it is fair to say that the defeat of ONeill, and it could have happened anywhere, the fact that it was at Kinsale just was an accident of history, so to speak. He had believed very strongly that he would need, well, he understood the English very well because he had been fostered out to them, or actually kidnapped by them, but anyway, whatever. So he understood their court very, very well, and he knew that he would need foreign help. Anyway, so those who remained were in entrenched or fortified houses, even castles. ONeill well understood the concept of land ownership being vested in the nations, as he called it, as he put it, meaning the tuath in Gaelic. In 1599, he drafted a set of principles for peace with Elizabeth that tell us a lot about the old order. Elizabeth and the English were not interested in peace, just conquest. So as I said, they rejected it out of hand. He asked that the for instance, he asked that the tradition be continued of a thing called Gavelkind. This is very interesting. 2 words, Gavel, G-A-B, aspiration, A-L. It actually means to gather, to take possession of, to various. And kind is literally kindred, the people, and it means the people, if you like, the Ochaha, of the what do you call them again? The of the you're forgetting words. Anyway, of the Thor, essentially the people, and it literally means taking of the kindred. The taking of the kindred. Now, the kindred doesn't mean kids. Oh, I'll double back it. Roughly means the people, where the ultimate owners of the Thor land, unlike in English systems, where since 1066 the sovereign owned all the land by right of conquest. I'll come back on this a second again. All ownership or estates were therefore real estates, that is, from the king. So that's kind of just a little broad stroke that I want to lay out there. But now I want to tell you about what this Gavelkind meant. The Irish tradition of Gavelkind, Kina is C, by the way. There's no K in the Irish language. C is like the P. It's either it's K, it's strong, or else it's aspirated when it becomes like C. So Kina is the equivalent of us kind or kindred. So the Irish tradition of Gavelkind protected the rights of underage children in the event of their parents' death. It was not a seizing, as it has been misunderstood by English scholars. And the reason it was a protection of the children's rights was because upon such a father's death, a father who had underage children, his land technically passed back to the Kina, the people, who maintained responsibility for it until the children came of age, when it was apportioned back out to his children. An extraordinarily fair and far-thinking concept. Now, on coming across it, or encountering it in Ireland, the English, starting with the Normans, mistakenly called it Gavelkind. And it's hard to figure out whether it was just a mispronunciation of Gavelkind, but whatever, it was because it's their misunderstanding of it, because it resembled a very awkward and much less sophisticated Saxon system that they had encountered and existed in Kent, which was called Gavelkind. Now, whether or not the Kent system got to be called Gavelkind and had been called something by a Saxon name before that, and that the Normans and the later imputed this. But anyway, a lot of confusion between the two. They are totally, completely different. And Gavelkind was outlawed in England in later times, and also outlawed in Ireland later as the conquest progressed through the Tudor conquest, the 16th, 17th centuries. Again, under the mistaken belief, well, for many reasons. They also wanted, because it favoured the preservation of the land ownership system under the Gaelic state. But anyway, if you see the word Gavelkind, and always I retch when I see it in history books, because I know before I even read the context that it's all screwed up, because they don't understand what Gavelkind actually meant. But the extraordinary and beautiful thing about it was that in his document, ONeill described it perfectly, and he understood exactly what it was. And not only that, but he fought to have it retained. And of course, boom, instantly, Elizabeth out, no way. So obviously that clues you in that it was a very powerful way of preserving ownership in deserving in the right people in the Tuatha. In other words, there was no king at the top trying to grab it from you, using every excuse that you could. And the English invented most of them, like as cheating. I'll come to that in a second. But it was an extraordinary thing and an incredibly great indicator of, to me, it's at the very heart of the old Gaelic system of land ownership, in that they covered that eventuality so well, which underlined and just absolutely proved their commitment to two things: to the fundamental theory of sovereignty of the Tuatha, that it's the people that own the land, and that they get to decide who actually owns it, so to speak, who gets to use it, and it's usually because of merit and tradition and line of ownership. So I get very energized about that one, because it says so much. So it roughly means that the people who are the ultimate owners of the Tuatha land, unlike the English system, where since 1066, in other words, the defeat of the Saxons and the conquest by the French Normans, huge event. Totally everything begins is either side of the 1060, the conquest in Britain is England, as any English child and everybody knows. Before the conquest, after conquest, and after that, the sovereign owned the land by right of conquest. In other words, God chose the Norman king against the Saxon king. So William the Conqueror was favoured by God, and the English king was not. All ownership of estates was therefore real estates, real, from the king. So that's where the word real estate comes from, as you know. Did you know that?
No.
No?
So the king had the right to keep the land or give it to him?
Well, in the sense that when William the Conqueror beat Albert, was Albert, wasn't it?
Harold.
Thank you, Harold, the guy that got the arrow in his eye. Harold, go Saxon King Harold. He won the entire kingdom, and he actually commissioned a book called the Domesday Book, where they wrote down every pig and chicken and everything there was. So an incredibly important and wonderful record of England, English history. I wish we had it. Well, maybe not, because it would have meant that we'd been conquered by them. They didn't quite get to putting it in the book. But, I mean, theoretically, he owned the whole thing. And he wanted to know, well, what do I own? So then all land was then granted from him, so that it was an estate granted by the king, by the real, their king. Same concept applied in most of Europe. In fact, that's what they had brought in. The Normans were, of course, Europeans, as you know, feudal Europeans. So the same idea was the French, or not French, but the Spanish, when they came here, the Spanish land grants and so on. So that's the concept of real estate from the king, is the estate, the ownership. Estate is actually an old English word for ownership. So estate is the ownership that you have is from the king. Now, the Archbishop, okay. The English system, on the other hand, used. Okay, now to contrast, and I think we'll break. Is it 9 o'clock yet, Margaret?
8 o'clock.
I mean 8 o'clock. Yeah, we usually break at 8, so we're dead on time. I want to contrast the alternative, or the non-existence, if you like, of a Gavelkind, if you like, Gavelkind, of the Gaelic system with what the English system was. And you can imagine it's very different, because it's a top-down ownership concept rather than a bottom-up ownership concept. But anyway, the English, who obviously did recognize forms of ownership, even though they did come from the king, but they were all trying to get it back again. Most everything was, granted, of course, to powerful nobles who needed to be paid off for their services in the conquest to start with. So that's how most of the very large royal or noble families in England came about, was because they were with William on the boat coming over, so to speak, and because they played large, commanded a horse regiment or something like that, so they got large tracts. But anyway, they had a theory of wardship. I'll read what I've written down here. The English system, on the other hand, used its theory of wardship to escheat. You've heard that expression before, to escheat, we'll talk about in a second, vast amounts of land to the crown. They literally, in Ireland, they accelerated the process by literally kidnapping Irish children, noble children, such as ONeill himself, and made them wards of state in order to ultimately acquire their land. And later on, I'm just skipping over here because we'll go into it in the second half. And later they did other things like making, putting a condition on the inheritance of land on becoming a Protestant. So, and the Irish kind of cheated them a little bit in that respect, that there would be 4 or 5 sons, and they'd kind of draw lots, and one of them had to become a Protestant, then he'd own the land. So that there's a good deal of that has come down through the ages, where there was like the token proddy was in there, even before the concept of the soup, which didn't come in until the middle of the famine years. If you had heard the expression of the supers, because the proselytizers, said, we'll give you soup if you become a Protestant. But anyway, if you like, all of those abuses came from the fundamental concept of the ownership, that the king, if the king owned the land and he had to give out large portions of it to get certain things done, he was always trying to get it back again so he could give it out again or get the income from it. So they had lots of nasty tricks, and wardship was the total antithesis of, I hate to use the expression Gavelkind, but, and that's why I want to leave it, in that the Irish system was a protection of the rights of the child, whereas in fact the English system was where they actually used the future inheritance, the fact that this child was going to inherit this estate, so that if they could grab that child and work him into their world. And that's exactly what they did with Hugh ONeill. They brought him over and as a, then knowing that he would become the owner of the vast estates. And then if they can make you into a trader, then your land escheats to them by law. So that's how they will claim they gained ownership of a tremendous amount of land by tainting or attainting the owners of the land that they had previously fostered in their own house to become the owner, and of course they conferred other titles like the Earl of Tyrone, just to establish his ownership of the so therefore if he ever screws up, we get his land, so that it was a title with a purpose, so that they were made earls, just to underline the fact that they're now under English law. So that the history of the 4 centuries that followed this great document that ONeill drew up in a vain attempt to preserve the old Gaelic order of ownership of land can be explained in the rejection of it. So that the entire 400 years that followed were predictable in that it was dispossession after dispossession after dispossession, to the final cataclysm of the famine, where they had impoverished. They had not. There was nothing. There was no nobility. There was no middle. There was nothing. There was just entirely a compressed 8.5 million people down into the lowest possible levels, and only the English landlords at the top, to the point where it cracked, because the machine on which it ran, that 8.5 million people that was working the land and surviving on just one crop, one fuel in their engine collapsed. So that they actually collapsed their own system, and then gradually over the remainder of the 19th century, they started to get back the ownership of the land. And we'll talk about that after the break. Thank you very much.
Is it okay to ask you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thanks. I was going to ask, when you were talking about the young boy of 14 and the grandfather, what would be the age that someone might expect to live to? Like, how old would the grandfather be if well, I mean, I guess the grandfather would be 45 years old, possibly. 24.
Those that survived did quite well.
So that was the exception if you had a grandfather.
Well, no, there was probably going to be a grandpa or a grandma, and they probably actually lived to be a good age.
Like what age?
Right up to modern times, up to 80s.
Yes. Really?
Yeah.
It's ancient times.
Yes.
But then there was a time probably when they didn't, when that age went way down.
No, the way I see it is, there was a tremendous amount of mortality along the way, but a certain number did survive to great age.
To a certain age, you could get one.
It seems that way.
And then, what about how did one become an ex-slave? How did you get away from, get not be a slave?
By being of use to the community, because the community gave, if you like, license for slavery, in the sense that, yes, it was okay for this land over here to have English slaves or whatever, and they were tended to be foreigners. Did tend to be brought in. That was okay, but if that slave showed talent and was of great could be of great use to the community claimed him.
And said, we don't want him to be a slave.
You're not going to get to keep that kid on your own, or that person for yourself. We want to put him to good use. So that again is one of the great proofs that they were so community oriented. That the community actually was boss. They ruled the roost. And that what I'd like to do in the second half is try and relate all of this to what happened in the 400 years afterwards, after it pretty well became destroyed, and how it explained what ultimately happened in the Land League, the land wars of the late 1900s, and how Ireland, after it got rid of the landlord system and started to come back as an independent republic, how it adopted and reverted back to a good many of the old concepts. So, and it's still happening. But I'd like to sort of give you a mental picture of, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Ireland, but those of you who have, hopefully you've been to East Galway or South Mayo or Roscommon, where there are just, I hesitate to say millions, but certainly tens of thousands of stone walls. And I mean, that's what strikes you about the countryside, is all these incredible stone walls. Remember those? Now, they didn't just appear overnight. So they're the living evidence, proof of all the things we've been talking about. Those were how the land was divided up. And each of those fields represent literally millennia of a system of agriculture. And then if you look out from there, and you'll see on the hillsides and in the river valleys and so on, no fences. So now you have an idea of the social system, so that the common land was available to everybody in the Tuatha to graze where he felt. There was no restrictions. Nobody owned any better rights than the next on unenclosed land. And there was a relationship between how much infield, as it was known as, those enclosures. Obviously, they were the most fertile parts of the Tua. And of course, that's where they grew their corn, which was largely oats. Irish was famous for oatmeal, still is, wheat and so on. But the oats was its main crop. So one of the ways that a slave could get himself moving up the ladder was if he owned cattle, a cow, if he managed to come into the ownership of a cow or and so if his owner or his master maybe gave him a cow as a reward for a lot of hard work, and then he grew those cows, he eventually would actually qualify for ownership of land inside in the arable section. You know why? Because he had cow dung. Seriously, believe it or not, your entitlement to land in the infield was directly related to how many cows that you owned, whose droppings that you could actually carry and bring down and fertilize the land, which was incredibly smart, because obviously if you weren't fertilizing the land, you were just depleting it. So there was a direct relationship between the two. So the competition outside on the hills for a herdsman, a successful herdsman, could actually lift himself up relatively quickly by his ability to maintain a herd, which required great skills in husbandry, not least of which was animal health. You know, even as growing up as a kid, I remember farmers who was looked down upon because everything they touched died. Yeah, they just weren't able, whether it was hygiene or what. You know, they weren't able to take care of cattle. Other farmers had what Father Duran would nod their heads and say, "It's got magic hands." You know, that man would go over, and if there was a sick cow or a sick cow, he'd somehow do something. He'd straighten their bones out, or, you know, often it was literally chiropractic work. He would just literally get at that thing and straighten out whatever was ailing the animal or the beast. So animal husbandry was a great art, a great craft. And whether it was with horses or with cattle or with sheep or pigs or whatever. So you can see how the system worked to the community as a whole, to their advantage as a whole. Now, one little thing I want to sort of use as a segue into the more modern times, and that was rent. What was the concept of rent? Obviously, somebody paid somebody something. You know, there was something going on. Well, underlying the whole concept was the concept of fair rent. Just as there was great detailed concepts of fair restitution for an injury, whether it was a personal injury or whether it was goods or whatever. So fair rent occupied a tremendous amount of the legal thinking. So needless to say, it resulted in a fair rent, which it did. So that there was a great sense of fairness about it, and everybody accepted it, that it was fair. So for instance, if you had the use of a paddock, let's say, and it was the grass of, say, 10 cows, and you had it for a year or what, so you would, when you moved out, you'd leave a cow behind. So everything was done in kind. You know, you didn't turn up and pay them out in shekels or in marks or whatever certainly not in coins, because they didn't have that same concept of that top-down control where you had the king's head and all the rest of it. Everything was done by barter system and in kind.
When did the
Kevin.
cash economy come in?
The cash economy, I would say not until the 17th century.
Similar to Scotland.
It came with the English.
Yeah.
It came with the English. Now the Normans tried to introduce it and did to some extent. And they tried very hard, and again they succeeded to a large extent in destroying the old system of grinding. And so you'll see most of what they did was they destroyed the old grindstones. And you'll still see them, most of them are broken. And you'll still see them literally in gaps being used around the country. And occasionally you'll come across one intact, which was probably buried and had survived the industrialization of the Normans. The Normans, what they did was they set up a centralized system on a river. If you notice where all the Norman castles and everything, they're always on a river. They always are associated with a mill, a water-powered mill, and machinery. And of course, the monasteries were European, and they were essentially Norman. And you'll see exactly the same thing there. They set up the equivalence of like a mission here in California, self-sustained, and they set up a mill. Now, by breaking all of the old grindstones and requiring the people to literally bring their oats and corn for milling at a price into the mills, they changed the entire economy and did great damage to it. But they didn't really change it totally. They didn't change the ownership. They certainly resulted in more roads and more transportation being required. The opposite to what's they're trying to go the opposite now, where everything is all self-sustainable. Like smart growth and city of villages and all that stuff. Well, the Normans broke that up and tried to regionalize things so that they became great lords. But that's a little aside. But the relationship between the outfield, the commons, and the infield was very powerful. Now, while everything was paid in kind, and it was not a feudal system in the sense that it was an economic system rather than a power system. Feudal system was more military. It required a payment to a superior lord, to a lord, and then he in turn. And that was a much more hierarchical and a much more stringent system and a much more top-down system. That's not the concept of the fair rent that the Gaels had. It had a very deep basis in economics, so that it was entirely based upon the fair payment for the use of land. So therefore it was based upon the use of land. So that if your 10 cattle ate that grass for that length of time, everybody understood that had a value, that there was something that you had to give back, if you like. So the concept of giving back was very great. Now I have a reason for that, and I call it a segue, because when the dark ages, if you like, of oppression finally started to come to an end in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, having gone through the horrible 1600s with Cromwell and the whole thing, and the 1700s, which were just literally the dark ages of Ireland. And the 1800s actually did open things up, even though it ended up in the middle of the century with the horrific famine. But the early part of the century actually was the ordinary people became quite well off, largely because they were the breadbasket, they were the food machine for the English war with the French, so that they actually gained quite a lot. That was one of the reasons the population exploded in Ireland, was because of the great wars between the Napoleonic Wars, the English fighting Napoleon. But as Ireland started to emerge from the landlord era as a result of the famine, the concept of fair rent reemerged in the land league, and that's why I said it's like a segue. So when they came up with the concepts of fixed tenancy, fixture of tenancy, the 3 Fs, so that you had actually a fixity of tenure. In other words, you weren't being bounced around from one field to the other, or this place or that place, at the will of some master. You actually ground yourself into the ground, into the earth. And that was how you got yourself up in the ancient world, was you became more and more and more burrowed into a parcel of land. And the more you were in there, the more you had ownership of that land, and the more you were protecting your descendants. So that your entire status was entirely tied up with your tenancy, if you like, and the tenancy in a broad sense, in the fact that you had been there for a long time, that you were really part of the land. Now, they wanted to bring that, and even after 2.5 centuries, almost 3 centuries, the ordinary farmers in Mayo and Galway and around the country, who still were the old Gaelic, some of the landowners and farmers in the east coast wouldn't have much of a consciousness of that, because they were planters. They were descendants from the later successful plantations that occurred during the Cromwellian period and so on. But the people of Connacht and Donegal, the west of the Shannon, was still there even after a few hundred years. They understood the way it should be. So that it's wonderful to think about and contemplate what actually happened during that period, when their oppressors had been weakened by their own excesses, namely the famine. They started to resurrect back the old land system. And I just find that really encouraging. Yes, Kevin?
The longer you were there, the more rights you had.
In a broad sense, yes.
How did that work with the fair rent?
No, I'm talking now about the ancient times. Is that what you mean?
Well,
When you think about what we talked about earlier,
fair rent, you could grind yourself into a piece of...
well, that's fixity. That's the fixture of tenancy.
Can you explain that a little more?
Well, yes, if you remember back to the 3 levels that I said, where you have the Midboss, the Ochara and the Boara. It didn't happen overnight. You just didn't go in and conquer a piece of land and put your flag down and say, this is mine. You augured, you set down roots in it, and you probably went through a few generations, maybe all the way up from slavery up to a sharecroppers type of thing, till eventually you got on the first rung and so on. So it took several generations, literally living on that same little riverbed or bog or wherever to get yourself up. So therefore, all of those people who were Boaras, they stood on a column of generations going back into great lengths of time. Sorry,
So
yeah.
everybody had to know that, so your neighbor had to know that you've been there for for generations, so everyone had to know about everybody else.
That's right.
In some way, and keep track of it, because obviously people would have wanted to have everybody else's land. So
right.
how do they keep track anyway? Just oral
Yes,
history?
they had a class of people for that, the Fili, and all the poems and the poetry and most of the stuff that were recited was recited as great compliments and complimented, so that you can imagine within a second, Kevin, them gathered around in, say, a strong farmer's house, in a Boara's house, and there's nothing that he preferred to listen to than his lineage, and he would have a Fili, a poet, somebody who would recite all of that, and they would never tire of it, and they would nod their heads and say, "Yep, yeah, I was there since the flood."
I just was thinking about this, that my mother talked about a poem.
Yeah.
A poet writing about the O'Flynn's of Mill Stream,
Mm-hmm.
and that's some name that's way back in our history.
Yeah.
And there was a little poem there was a poem.
Oh, I'm sure there was. And that's so traditional. Everything was by poem. Because that's how they remembered it. It was all rhymed. And that's how they remembered it. And they all went along and nodded and they all knew it, verse after verse after verse. So yes, that's how it was passed down. But it was with tremendous pride. And I can tell you that from my own experience, because my mother had the most unbelievable pride in the land that she came from. Kevin.
I hate to propose it, but the feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same, at least the movie adaptation. It's the same. It's the story of the old system. You've been on that land forever, and then the cash economy comes in with cash.
Correct.
So this takes it right out.
And that's why John B. Cain wrote it. Because John B. Cain was steeped in this. Just like he wrote the Buds of Ballybunion. He understood what a buddera was and what they were. They were the better off land owners who could afford to come and spend a week in a guest house at the beach. You know, he understood all of that. So yeah, John B. Cain had some wonderful stuff about. So that's exactly why I wrote the movie, or the play, The Field, which then became the movie.
I want to say, Patrick, some of this is happening in Iran today. My grandfather, great-grandfather had a land. Obviously, I have a piece of land in some village in northern Iran. Because somebody told somebody that this is a great-grandson someplace in the world should have that land and it's there someplace.
Well, you should go back and claim it.
It was just poetry and notes and word of mouth.
And bring back some young girl with you and have a young one with her. And tell them that's your land. You're now a buddera.
Could you cover the 3 F's and you were talking about fixing the tendency. You were relating ancient to modern and how going forward with that idea, how that changed the nature of land tenure in Ireland.
Yes, I'm going to try and do that. And that's why I wanted to segue right across the centuries of destruction, and there's nothing there. It was just horrible as a result of poor Hugh ONeill not being destroyed. And it's exactly what I'd like to do. The concept of recognizing fixity of tenants. In other words, the very same people, and I can tell you from my own experience on both my father's side and my mother's side, the depth of pride and knowledge and understanding of their attachment to the land is just, you can't even put words on it. Particularly my mother. Maybe because my father died, so I didn't have the same interrelationship with him. But certainly the mother. Now, what they were basically saying was, they didn't just arrive there in the last couple of generations. So the fixity of tenure, if you like, that was one of the demands of the Land League, was a recognition of the fact that they were deep into that land. It was like a fundamental right that they required, and the concept of fair rent.
Is this the same case like Tina and Martin have in Cali Galway? She had to go back home. The father passed away. They had a house there.
It is a lot like that. The land that the O'Days own in Moycullen. Pardon?
The O'Days, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And again, if you look at that land, it's beautiful land, and it has again all of the little stone walls, which always tells me that it's very, very, very ancient, because you just don't build walls like those. And I asked an engineer once if they could estimate the amount of carrig, the amount of rocks, and if somebody ever did that, and they could, using whatever, calculus or whatever the hell they do that stuff, the average number of miles, they could do it with satellites. What they'll find is that is probably equivalent and far outstrips the pyramids of Egypt or any other man-made object on the face of the earth. I don't think that there is another man-made object. It's just that it's spread out. But if you think of the billions of man-hours that necessarily had to go in to build those walls over a very, very long period, it's an awesome thing. And nobody has written about it or looked at it in that sense. And it's so sad. As I said, if they were piled high in the form of a monument, they'd be one of the 7 wonders of the world. but because it's spread around, and nobody, and surely some, well, I'm sure they will one day scratch their head and say, let's do some numbers on this, and like a linear mile, or average length, and come up with a rough estimate of how many stones there are in East Galway. And now you're talking about a culture that must have necessarily extended over probably 5 or more centuries, or millennia. So this is something that's very deep and felt very, very deeply. And it's not at all surprising that the land war and the land league started right there in the heart of that country. You know it well as a tour guide, Robert. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You know exactly how it's like. You go on and on and on with those, even just the road between Galway and Tuam. You're surrounded on both sides of the road by this massive, and the Burkes, the Burke family, which later became McWilliams. They they Gaelicized their name from de Burke to McWilliam, and then you had the McWilliam titles and so on. But anyway, that was but to get back to what you want, Robert, about the segue and the what's the third one? Purchase or sale, fair price? What was the third?
3Fs.
Pardon? What's the third one?
I don't know,
What is the third one?
I'll get it in a second. I'll get it in a second. My God. Anyway, I'm kind of fascinated with those two because I can see their coming through after the centuries of dispossession, and then they largely succeeded through the concept of the boycott, which was named, as you know, after an English small landlord called Captain Boycott from East Anglia. He went back to East Anglia. Again, if you were to see his estate, if you want to call it that, the land that he owned outside Ballinrobe, it's like absolutely smack dab in the middle of these little fields, which truly are an awesome thing. And if you've ever heard the fields of Athenry, so the modern artistic people in Ireland are aware of this. It's not unsurprising that one of the most popular songs in the last few decades has been the Fields of Athenry. And Athenry is, again, smack dab in the middle of that territory, that world of the small little fields. Those small fertilized fields. And then on a large scale, they're surrounded by mountains, so that you have all of Connemara and all the mountains of Mayo and so on, where they could literally haul. By the way, they also hauled seaweed, as the movie The Field demonstrated. So fertilizing these fields was a very important part of the labor of the day. But anyway, it was only appropriate that the actual demise of the English landlord system literally took place or took root, beginnings, right there in that area. And it's also a great credit to Charles Stewart Parnell, who was a landlord himself from Wicklow, certainly not a man of the land in small land, but yet he understood Irish history and understood the Irish persona. His mother was American. He was, of course, from a very old Irish family in the East Coast, but nevertheless. But he had the foresight and the political acumen to go down to Westport and actually take charge of the movement. And he made a great contribution in that he said, with the great authority of him being the leader of the Irish party in Westminster, and that was a very important, he was a very important part of the Westminster, the House of Commons. And he said to them famously in Westport, a great rally, keep a firm hold on your land. Was that his exact words? Keep a firm hold on your land. And of course he got right to the hearts of the people, and they never really, then people never actually ever gave up on him. The church did, and all the upper class people and the petites, the people never did, because they knew he understood what the land meant to them. And when he said that, it was a words for all time, if you like. He had their hearts forever, and he did. And he always went back there to sort of renew himself. And he was actually on his way, he had just come from there when he went down, and in those days you travelled by steamboat train and down to Brighton, and died in Brighton, literally having come back from the west of Ireland, Ballydreen. But so then, as the whatever you want to call it, the reawakening started to really catch on towards the end of the 19th century in the form of the Home Rule movement, the Land League movement, the Celtic Dawn, you know, the reawakening of the literary movement and so on. It all kind of started to, it was like a natural, it's like blossoming back out again. It was kind of amazing, really, that the poets came back out. It was like springtime, you know, and the land, and all of these things happened. Almost like a natural phenomenon, almost like something coming straight out of the land. Culminating, of course, in, as you know, the 1916 rebellion. Again, probably more the heart of which was Pádraig Pearse, who again made the expression of watering the rose tree. It was very much a natural thing, only he said we have to water it with our own blood. So the idea of nurturing something coming out of the land with them was incredibly ingrained in Pádraig Pearse. He understood that, in all his poetry. And what's nice about Pádraig Pearse is he wrote in the Gaelic tongue, and he wrote it beautifully, even though his father was an Englishman. But his mother was an Irish woman. And again, you know, the Irish are they adopt very easily like that. So he had that. And W.B. Yeats had it, but unfortunately he had to use the English tongue because he was from the English planter class, if you like. But he had a great, or at least he acquired a great knowledge and understanding of the Irish language. Douglas Hyde was probably the best example of the English that was left in Ireland now becoming almost more Irish than the Irish themselves, because he again was the son of a Protestant minister who grew up on what could be described as mensal land, in that they had a domain which was went with the vicarage. What's the matter? You have a question? Okay, wonderful.
What's the Land League actually do?
What did it actually do? What did it do? What was it? Well, of course, it was a popular Browns Up movement of tenant farmers. It was a formal association of tenant farmers, formed a bit like a trades union, but different in that it was dedicated to achieving reform of land ownership. And they used the word Land League, I guess because it was understood by then English-speaking world, because remember the English had spent almost the entire 1900s in destroying the Irish language, so mostly even a lot of the better off Irish peasantry spoke English, but it was it was an association of tenant farmers. And a lot of the songs was, you know, hooray for the bold tenant farmer and everything. So it was a tenant farmer moves.
Did people apply to this organization to get land?
No,
There
no.
was no assignment of land through them? Or?
No, because it was essentially a political action committee, a political action group. It was similar to a lot of the ones that we have today, like the environmentalist movement and so on, which is a special interest group. So no, it didn't have any legal authority. It was in fact an activist group outside the existing. You know, it was an agitation. It was a group of what would be currently known and even then known as agitators. They were agitating for land reform. So they were a militant group in the sense that the action that they took was very direct. It wasn't just making speeches and writing books. They took very direct and very effective action in the form of the boycott. And I'll explain the boycott to you if you like, real quick.
Yeah, because it's 9 o'clock.
It's 9 o'clock. But I just want to, real quick, fast forward.
Dublin has said, you know, so now who will we pay the rents to?
Well, that was an illustration of how incredibly that incident took place in Bohola, in County Mayo, and I'll tell you, it was an anecdote that was recorded by Michael Davitt in his writings to illustrate how incredibly downtrodden the tenant farmer had become. When, after a speech that Michael gave, Michael was an MP, and great speaker, of course, and very passionate speaker because he came from straight, not 4 or 5 miles away from Bohola where he gave this. But he spoke, you know, he was a frequent speaker all around the area. And a farmer came up to him and he says, "But Mr. Davitt, if we get rid of the landlords, who are we going to pay our rent to?" That he almost despaired. You know, so Michael retold that story, and just to illustrate how incredibly downtrodden they'd become. The concept of them ever actually owning land and not having to tip the hat and bend the knee to the landlord just hadn't gotten through to them. But nevertheless, if he hadn't done what he did, it would never have gotten through. So it shows that he did, with the aid of a very great man that often gets forgotten, and that was James Daly, the owner of the local newspaper. So it shows you how important the Copleys of the time back there actually still are. So James Daly, and the newspapers were very widely read, often by somebody who read to a family audience, but nevertheless were very widely read. So the people were very well informed. So the ideas that were spreading very, very rapidly and very effectively. But nevertheless, they did rise out of that. Maybe not that generation, but certainly their following generation. That would have been in the perhaps 1880s. That incident would have taken place. So that there was a good deal of progression later on. And then there was various land acts, and the most important being the Wyndham Act. And I think it was 1604 or 5 or 6, somewhere in there. Was it 03? 16. It was very early in the that was the most important one, but there were several others. And now I want to very quickly fast forward through what really happened. As it was clear to the British government that the old landlord days were really finished. It just wasn't, they weren't there. Well, because of the economy, really. They were coming back to England, selling out, the old landlords were, those that actually ever were in Ireland, or they're more likely their agents, like Boycott. Boycott actually didn't own the land. He was managing the land, and he had a tenancy of the land. But he was he managed a larger hunk of land, and he had that particular little portion for himself. For his own maintenance, as the word maintenance was the word they would use for that. So they were coming back in droves, just like they had in the early part of Elizabeth's reign, when they were coming back from Cork and the East Coast in great droves and in great distress. So they were now bailing out and coming back to England, and so it was clear that it was an unsustainable economy anymore. So they started to look for ways of moving ownership into the to the tenants of the land. So there was various land acts passed, and the British set up a thing called the Land Commission, which the new Free State actually continued, and it was the bureaucracy, if you like, the administration of how all of this took place. It was an incredibly complicated and also very contentious process that went on for several decades, starting in the early first couple of decades of the 20th century and running right up into literally modern times, certainly into the 50s. And I personally have tried to get records from the Irish government, the Irish Department of Lands, on the Land Commission, and they will not issue, they will not give any of that information to the public. And they say that it's because there's still wounds, if you like, enough generations haven't gone by, because there was an awful lot of charges of favoritism. You can imagine when there's a big change going on like this, and a bureaucracy which often is recruited from a local area, will tend to have people in there who take advantage and whose relatives get a larger share than others. So there was a tremendous amount of unhappiness generated throughout the period. But if you ignore that for a moment, over the first half of the 20th century, there was a tremendous re-entitlement of land. People who had been tenants became owners. So it really is an amazing story how the land ownership did. The people who worked those small little farms on the west of Ireland, probably their ancestors go all the way back to literally thousands of years. And it's wonderful to see some of those names, O'Connors and the various people, still there, still on those pieces of land, that without doubt go back into the way pre-Christian times. And they have a consciousness of that. They really do. So that's a nice note to end on. So there.